Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along and welcome to the Real Jesus Seminars. We're going to be taking a bit of a look over the next 3 nights at Jesus and who Jesus was and wasn't, and what we can know about this person. But before we start tonight, I just want to make a couple of announcements, just so that you know what to expect and what's going to happen tonight. Firstly, thank you for most of you for registering tonight. Basically, we've got a free book that we want to offer and give to people who would like it. But we just need your details so that we can get that to you afterwards. We need to order those books, so we didn't want to order too many. But so thanks for registering. That will basically be delivered sometime after the program, most probably in the next couple of weeks. Also, you'll notice that on your name badge, if you have a look on the back of your name badge, there should be a number. Does anyone not have a number? No, no one's missing a number. You should have a number there. Now, we're in a sporting convention centre, so it's right that we should be doing a little bit of a raffle in a way, but we are thankful that you've come along tonight, and as a part of that, we're giving away a free book as a door prize, and we'll be selecting that towards the end of tonight, just based on a random number selection. So just so you know, that number on the back of your name badge will be how we know who gets the book tonight. So thank you for coming along and registering and putting your details down for that. Lastly, after we finish tonight, there's going to be some refreshments up the back. There's going to be some hot and cold drinks and just some light nibbles as well. Feel free to stick around afterwards and just have a bit of a chat. The other thing I just ask is that I want to be sensitive to people's time, the time that you have. I want to keep these presentations to be relatively brief as much as we can. So I just ask that if you do have any questions, that just maybe if you keep them to the end, you can ask me afterwards. I'll be up the back and I'm happy to answer any questions people might have. But if you have any questions that you think others might like might want to ask as well, feel free to ask me. And if you feel it's something that you really think should be shared, I'm happy to share that the next night, if that makes sense. So just to keep things brief, we'll just keep questions till the end, till after we finish tonight. But thank you very much for coming along tonight. And I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Matthew Hunter, and I'm actually the pastor at the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in town in Bairnsdale. And I've been here for about 2 years, and I have to say, I'm loving East Gippsland, and I don't think I really want to leave. But I have to say I'm a little bit biased, because my background, I actually come from what I think is most probably the best city in Australia, which I'm sure a lot of you would disagree, because that's Adelaide. I actually grew up there. I lived there for 27 years, and I loved my time there, but when I was there, I finished school and I went and studied civil and structural engineering, and I worked as a civil engineer for about 4 years in Adelaide, before I finally decided that I wanted to make a career change. It was a fairly major career change. There's a few people, when I said that I was going to study theology, they said, "Oh, you're going to study geology," which kind of made more sense. But no, I went to study theology, and I've been a pastor for about 6 years now. So that's just a little bit of my background, and I hope that as tonight we go through this interesting topic, that you'll start to get a little bit more of an appreciation for where I come from in some of these things. I also wanted to quickly mention and talk about the image that we have on our advertising. You might have noticed this. One interesting story, there was, I heard a parent talking to me about this image. And they actually said to me, "Matt, my child is a little bit disturbed by this image that you have in your advertising." And I said, "Oh, why? What's the problem with the image that we have there?" And they said, "Well, they were saying to me that that's not Jesus." And they were quite upset. "That doesn't look anything like Jesus. That's not what Jesus looks like at all." And in many ways, that kind of reaction is quite deliberate. I just want to explain a little bit of why we put this kind of image on our advertising. Because when we think about who Jesus most probably would have been, we often see these images of Jesus. They're very European, aren't they? They're of someone who's blonde-haired and blue-eyed, Jesus was actually a Middle Eastern man. And he would have looked much more Middle Eastern. He was also a young man. He wasn't an older, much more stately sort of person, but he was a young man. And the other thing about him was that he was a young man of his times. He would have looked much more like, the other young men in his day did. So what we wanted to do is reflect an image that in some way might have, if Jesus was alive today, might possibly, and it's a bit presumptuous to say this really, but might possibly be a bit closer to what you might have expected Jesus could have possibly looked like. But that's just a little bit of an explanation for the image that we have there. Tonight's subject that we're looking at is to ask a really important and first question about this person, Jesus. And that is, did Jesus exist? Now, for some of you might wonder why we're asking that question, but there's a lot of debate, and there has been a lot of debate, especially even the last 200 years, about who this person was and whether he actually existed or not. Whether there's any evidence that we can actually give of whether he existed. Now, the talks over the next 3 nights, I want to give you a bit of an appreciation. Really, to go through the sort of information we're looking at over the next three nights, there is so much information behind what I'm presenting here that the best way to think about what these talks are really like, they're kind of like icebergs. Because when you think of an iceberg, when you look at it, you only see a small proportion of what's there, don't you? If I was to present all the information, which I'm sure you would get quite bored with, but if I presented all the information which was there, it would take a number of hours to actually be able to do that. So what I have tried to do as much as I possibly could, and honestly as I could, is to present the information in a summary form that tries to represent in some ways what the whole information is. So if you have that in mind, there's a lot more information behind what we're presenting here, and I want to be honest with you about that from the start. Well, I'm only presenting a summary really of what information is out there. But if you want to know more about some of these topics, I have actually put out on the table out the back just a suggested reading list of only a few of the books on some of these topics that will give you some more of that background information. So if you find these topics interesting and you want to look more into them, please take one of those sheets down the back, and that will give you some resources to look at to dig deeper and hopefully see more of what's underneath the surface as we go through. But as we mentioned, Jesus is one of those figures today that almost everyone has an opinion about. In fact, there's a lot of questions that people have about this person, who over 2 billion people today globally claim that they follow. The questions about this person are good ones, and we can't just dismiss them. And I want to share with you a few of these questions. I mean, there's many more questions than these. Is there really evidence that this man Jesus ever existed? Secondly, if there is evidence, then can we determine using the same criteria that historians use for anyone else, can we determine who the real Jesus of history really is, if he exists? Thirdly, can we have confidence in the record that is kept about him in the Bible? Or is the information in this source too tainted or unreliable to consider? What about the information that we see in the New Testament and the Bible? And then lastly, can we really separate clearly the truth about this figure from any myths and exaggerations? We're going to try to look through some of these tonight. I don't know if any of you have read or seen this book. It's called The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is most probably today one of the preeminent atheist thinkers of our time. And he wrote this book really to try to give some evidence against what the Bible says and against what people believe who follow organised religions. And I want you to notice one thing that he had to say in this book. He said, one of the truly bad effects of religion is that it teaches us that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. So if I want to summarise what he's saying here, he's saying that from what he sees with the evidence surrounding the Bible and religion and God, that if you're going to believe in God or if you're going to believe in the Bible, you've got to be satisfied with not having answers and not having evidence. And what we really want to do is we want to test this statement tonight. We want to see whether people who have faith have to be satisfied with not understanding why they believe what they believe. Is that a true statement? Is it fair for Richard Dawkins to really make this claim? I suppose what he's really trying to say is that those who follow faith or believe in something, really they're blind. You know, they're just kind of following around. They have what you call blind faith. You know, they're not basing it on any information. It's just based on, who knows, maybe a feeling. But I want you to notice one thing. There's one book in the Bible that speaks a lot about wisdom and knowledge. The very thing that Richard Dawkins says those who follow religion most probably don't have a lot of. And notice one statement that is said in Proverbs chapter 1 and verses 5 to 7. He says here, that the writer of Proverbs, a wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now here you have someone who's religious, who is writing in the Bible, and he says, in fact, it's people who are fools who despise wisdom and knowledge. The Bible actually makes many claims that it is about knowledge. It is trying to give knowledge. And it's not about trying to get people to believe beyond having any knowledge or any evidence at all. So let's look into this. When we think about Christianity, Christianity was from the very start a faith built on evidence. In fact, the first Christians called themselves witnesses. This was a legal term for someone who is an eyewitness to an event. You know, they were using the legal term of their day to identify themselves as witnesses. And it was a legal term of someone who was an eyewitness of the day to this person, Jesus Christ, who they say that they were represented. They say that they spent time with this person and that they saw the things he did and that they were eyewitnesses to them. And they spent their time trying to present their evidence to the people around them. But the question is, we're 2,000 years from that time. Those people have long since passed. How do we go about looking at the evidence that's around today? Really, I suppose one of the difficulties when we look at any topic like this is that today we're bombarded with information. We're bombarded with information about so many things. We have news reports sent to our smartphones in bite-sized chunks. We get sent lots of little graphics and bits of information on things like Facebook and Twitter, and no one seems to be bothered these days about actually referencing where they get their information from. So we have all these different pieces of information that may or may not be correct or true being bombarded and sent out in bulk to lots of people. But if you go back 20 years ago, if you wanted to look into a person, if you wanted to look into a person's life and find out information, and let's say a fairly famous person from about 50 years ago, and let's look at maybe Hitler. If you wanted to find out about his life and look at some information, where would you have to go to find information about him? Even 20 years ago, you would have to go to a library and look up books. Whereas today, we've got information at our fingertips. And people don't seem to be bothered with referencing where they get their information from. You would have had to go to a library and look up books about this person and try to find out some more information about him. Now today, if we type in Hitler's name to Google, you'll come up with over 97 million different web pages that claim to give information about this man. Some make wildly varying claims about this person and who he really was. Some say he didn't die in 1945, but instead he fled with Eva Braun, his wife, to Argentina and died there in 1965. In fact, there's even one website that actually claims that the Nazis, in fact, had a secret base on the dark side of the moon, and that Hitler fled there after the war. I mean, there's so much information today. How do you wade through it all? How do you get to know what's true and what's not? You know, one of the most bizarre claims in recent times actually comes from Richard Dawkins, who he talked about before. He actually claims that Hitler was a Christian and that he was motivated in what he did by his religious beliefs. And hence he was trying to say and give evidence that some of the worst things that are done in history have always been done in the name of religion. However, we know from a letter that has been published from Hitler to Martin Bormann, he said quite clearly, he said this: "The hardest blow that has ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity." So does that sound like a person who is motivated by some religious belief to do what he did? You know, there's so many people who make so many claims. We've got to be able to see what the real evidence is. You know, the reality of this man is he had to tolerate Christianity because most of his army was either Protestant or Catholic. Another myth about this man was that he was vegetarian or vegan. Right? Has anyone heard that before? He was vegetarian or vegan. You know, it's most probably true that he tried to avoid animal products as much as possible on the advice of his doctors for his health. But he was witnessed numerous times eating meat with relish, and it was said that he even had a love of ham. So we've got to be really careful when we look into... I mean, this is an amazing thing, because this is a person who's lived in the last 100 years, and there's so many different claims about him. People can make any sort of claim on a website and have it believed just because it's there. And if it's this confusing to find out information about a person who lived less than 100 years ago, how could we possibly be expected to find out solid information and actually find things out about a person who lived 2,000 years ago? How could we possibly know? Well, in the academic world, they use 3 tests to look at information about any character of history. There are 3 main tests which they use to look at any information about a person from history to see whether that information is verifiable and trustworthy. And these 3 tests which they use are the bibliographic test, the internal evidence test, and the external evidence test. They apply these to any writings about any character in history. And this is a standard thing done by any scholar today. So if we want to have a look at who Jesus was, and have a look at specifically the New Testament, which basically gives us most of the information we know about this man, then we need to assess that document based on these tests. And I'm going to go through and explain some of this tonight for you. The first test is the bibliographic test. To explain this simply, we are basically looking at how reliable the copies of ancient texts are. And when we think about the ancient texts we have, you know, I mean, most of the information we know about antiquity is from some sort of ancient text which has been written a long time ago. How reliable are the copies of these ancient texts? It is often cited that one of the biggest shortcomings of the New Testament, which writes about Jesus, is that we have no original copies left. Has anyone here heard that before? That there's no original copies left. How can we trust a text where we don't have the original copies of this document? It's one of the biggest shortcomings people talk about. And people sort of suggest that it's like Chinese whispers that you play in a schoolyard. You know, if the earliest text we have is a few hundred years after it was written, then how can we be sure that it hasn't changed over that time and something hasn't changed? How can we be sure it's telling us something that is close to that original text if we don't have the original in existence? And this is a fair question to ask. But did you realise, though, that if we applied this test to all ancient documents, and in fact even relatively modern ones, such as records of people's lives, such as Napoleon, we have no original manuscripts of any of these ancient writings? None. So how can you possibly determine whether anything written about anyone is to be trusted? Well, this is what the tests which the scholars use today. The bibliographic test was developed to do just this. Firstly, by looking at the number of existing copies or manuscripts that we have of a text. And then secondly, they look at what is the time difference between the date that it was supposedly written and the earliest copies that we have in existence. What was that time gap between the two? If that time gap is too great, we start getting a bit worried. And this is what they apply to many of the ancient texts. Well, people rarely question the existence of characters such as Julius Caesar, do they? Do you hear many people going around and wonder whether he really existed or not? But many people have questioned the existence of Jesus. And the question we've got to ask is that fair based on the evidence that we have? The fact remains from the analysis of the raw data that the New Testament, which details the life of Jesus, is, as one scholar noted, one of the most frequently copied and widely circulated books of antiquity. We know that the New Testament was originally written in Greek. And if you just want to go back to copies of the New Testament just in Greek, no other languages, not Latin or anything else, but you just want to look at the copies just written in Greek, and you were to count the number of copies that we have existing manuscripts of the New Testament today in that original language, the number of copies that exist today is over 5,500, just in the original language alone. Now, to us today, this might not seem like a lot of copies, because we've got the aid of the printing press. It's a lot easier to copy things. But back then, if you wanted to copy anything, you had to hand copy it. You had to hand write it and have handwritten copies. Now, to handwrite a huge document, you had to be pretty motivated to do so. You had to think that that document was pretty valuable. The question we've got to ask ourselves is this really a lot of copies that exist of the New Testament? Is this a lot for a document that was 2,000 years ago? How does this shape up against other ancient texts? One of the most amazing facts is that if we look at the next most frequently copied text that we have copies in existence still of an ancient text, the most common after the New Testament is Homer's The Iliad. Has anyone heard of Homer's The Iliad? Ancient book written in 800 BC. It's actually a poem. That's the most common after the New Testament. As far as copies go, the number of manuscripts that still exist today of this ancient book is 643. That's the next most common book of antiquity. And you might think to yourself, well, that was written 800 years before Christ. That's a long time ago. We wouldn't expect many copies of that to exist still. But the thing is, if we look at any ancient literature, even written closer to the time of Christ, we don't even have this many copies of them. This is the most common after the New Testament ancient literature that we have. The second part of this test is to measure the time between the earliest manuscript we have and when the text was claimed to have been written. Now, if we look at the Iliad, we kind of have the idea, people estimate, that it was written about 800 BC. Now, the earliest manuscript that we have is dated to about 400 BC. That's the earliest manuscript we have, or copy, of the Iliad, is dated to 400 BC. So the time gap we get here is about 400 years. Now, when we come to the New Testament, the date that it was written is estimated to be between about 50 to 100 AD. There's always people who try to stretch that out further, but then there comes new evidence that pushes it back to this sort of time range. It was written about 50 to 100 AD. The earliest manuscript we have of the New Testament, the earliest copy we have, was 114 AD. So that gives us a time gap of about 50 years. I mean, that's a pretty big disparity between the two of those. But we sort of have to look at this and think, well, how does this add up with the rest of ancient literature? How does this go? Well, I want to show you this table. There's a lot of information in this table, but basically this just compares some of the ancient documents of antiquity. So we have Homer's The Iliad, which we've looked at there. It was written in 800 BC. The earliest copies are around 400 BC, so we've got a 400-year time gap and 643 copies left. If we look at Herodotus, who wrote history, and he wrote from about 480 to 425, the earliest copies we have of any of his works are dated back to 900 AD. That's a time gap of 1,350 years, and there's only 8 copies left in existence. What if we have a look at Plato? Who here has heard of Plato? Many of you? Plato, who wrote about 400 BC, the earliest copies we have of any of his writings are 900 AD. A time gap of 1,300 years, and there's only about 7 copies left in existence. Demosthenes, 300 BC, the earliest copies we have are about 1100, 1400 year time gap. And I mean, there's quite a few of his copies of his works, about 200. Caesar, you know, this is Julius Caesar, and the writings about the Gallic Wars, written about 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copies we've got about 900 AD. You keep going down, you see Livy of Rome, his History of Rome, wrote about 59 BC to about AD 17. And we do have partial copies of it that are dated back to about 300. Well, we have a partial copy because there's only one. So that's a time gap of about 400 years, but it's only a partial copy. But if we have a look at a complete copy, we don't get a complete copy till 900 AD. And there's about 19 of those. Tacitus, a time gap of about 1,000 years and 20 copies. Pliny the Second, or Pliny the Younger, his Natural History was written about AD 61 to 113, and the earliest copies we've got are about AD 50. When we come to the New Testament, how does it stack up? Well, if you have a look at the parts, just partial bits of books, as I said before, the earliest manuscripts we've got are about 114 AD. And this is just partial bits because of the deterioration of the paper. You know, not all of it is there, which is about 50 years. If we have a look at complete books, we don't have any complete books until around 200 AD, a time gap of about 100 years. And then if you want to have a look at any copies that exist with most of the New Testament, the earliest we have is about AD 250. So that gives us about 150 years. But the earliest complete New Testaments we have is 325 AD. And you might be thinking, well, that's starting to get a bit of a long time period, 225 years. But compare that to any other writing of antiquity, it's nothing. It's a tiny time gap. And there are over 5,500 different copies. Now that different number here, 5,366, that's just basically discounting some of the fragments that people have that they don't want to count. So I said about 5,600 before, that includes fragments. But if we want to take the fragments out, then you get down to about 5,366, where you've actually got bits where you can legibly read. It's interesting because this information led Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was the principal librarian of the British Museum. Has anyone ever been to the British Museum and been to this library? It's an amazing library. In fact, this is the same library where Karl Marx wrote his manifesto. Now, if you take what he had to say when he looked at this evidence, and remember, he's a person who knew about literature, who understood these principles, what did he have to say about it? He said, in no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the book and the date of the earliest existing manuscript so short as that of the New Testament. In no other case do we have such a short gap. Glennie, another scholar, makes this point when looking at it. No one questions the authenticity of the historical books of antiquity because we do not possess the original copies. Yet we have far fewer manuscripts of these works than we possess of the New Testament. To call into question the validity of the New Testament on the basis of a bibliographic test would require any thinking person to have to question most of our history books of antiquity. We would need to question whether such people as Julius Caesar, William the Conqueror, and even Napoleon even existed at all. And how many people really want to throw out all of our ancient history at the same time? The second test we come to is what's called the internal evidence test. Now, this test is used by literary critics today, and it is based on Aristotle's dictum, which says that the benefit of doubt is to be given to the document itself, not to the critic's sceptical questions of it. So we need to assess it based on itself. And this test basically says that there should be no reason to doubt what a document says unless the document itself gives us the reasons to doubt it. And the ways that it can do that is by contradicting itself or having factual errors. So for example, someone giving a detail of something that happened in history and we know that the opposite happened. So this is the internal evidence test. Many people listen to that and they go, aha! You know, so many people over the last couple of 100 years say, we can thus disprove the Bible on this basis. We can disprove the New Testament. Absolutely. It's been constantly claimed by those keen to disprove the Bible that the New Testament is full of contradictions. But firstly, we need to actually define what a contradiction is so we understand. Now, if you had a friend who went to a party and you said to them, look, who was at the party? And he might say, well, I went to the party and I saw Joe there, and who else did I see? That's right, I saw Bill as well. So Bill was at the party. And then you see another friend who went to the same party and you say, well, who was at the party? And he just says, oh, I saw Joe there. Is that a contradiction? Well, it's not a contradiction, it's a difficulty. We call it a difficulty because it's a different piece of information. But to be a contradiction, the two pieces of information have to be mutually exclusive. For those two pieces of information to be a contradiction, they have to actually disprove each other. Now, if I just said Joe's there, I haven't said whether Bill's there or not. I might not have talked to Bill, so I didn't remember. But if I was to say that I only saw Joe there, then we would have a contradiction. The interesting thing is that in the New Testament, there are so many people that have constantly brought up difficulties in different pieces of information that the Gospels talk about different events. And they've brought up these difficulties, but they've called them contradictions. But to this day, there have never been found two completely contradictory statements that have been proved to be contradictory. Let's consider the New Testament. In the New Testament, we have 4 accounts of Jesus' life called the Gospels, written by 4 different people. Now, 2 of these people, Matthew and John, were claimed to be eyewitnesses of those very events. Mark and Luke wrote their accounts largely from the accounts of others. Mark, it is said by other ancient historians, wrote his Gospel account by listening to Peter, an eyewitness of these events, and writing them down. Luke himself says that the way that he compiled his Gospel was by listening to eyewitnesses. So in a way, he was kind of like a reporter, and he wrote down what he heard from others. Now, if we think about an eyewitness's evidence, in a court of law today, the most valuable and reliable type of testimony is that of an eyewitness. However, is it expected that if 2 people give evidence in a court of law about a single event, that they're going to give exactly the same details? In fact, today, if you go into a court of law and you have 2 witnesses talking about the same event, and they give exactly the same details of what happened, that evidence is usually thrown out. It's completely suspicious because it seems like they've colluded and come up with the same story. Because people remember things differently, don't we? If you're in an event, you might be talking to one person, I might be talking to another. I might notice the colour of a person's hat, you might notice the colour of the person's shoes. We will remember and we will reflect different things. But does that mean that our evidence is incorrect because we give slightly different perspectives on the same event? No, it just means we're all different and we think about things differently. This is exactly what we see in the New Testament. We see different people giving different versions of the same events, and they focus on different details, they focus on different things. In fact, if all of the Gospels said exactly the same thing and gave exactly the same details, we would have question to call into question the validity of those details. And to put it this way, I want to give an example of one contradiction people talk about. This is a Venn diagram showing the information that Matthew and Luke give on a particular topic. And the topic is, who was present at the tomb after Jesus' resurrection? Now, if you go to Luke, he will say that there were 2 angels at the tomb. Whereas if you go to Matthew, he says there was an angel. He doesn't say how many angels there are. Maybe he doesn't think it's important to say how many angels there are. But the thing is that they're not two mutually exclusive pieces of information. It's quite likely that Matthew might have just said, oh, well, there were angels. He actually wasn't there to see it, so he's referring to what people said to him back. So he says, well, there's angels. Or there was an angel. But Luke was very thorough in his research in talking to the eyewitnesses and finding out all the details. He was like a good reporter. He wanted to find out all the information. So he found it really important to specify that those two angels. They're not two mutually exclusive pieces of information, as one example. But many people look at this as an example and say, well, there you go. There is an evidence of inconsistency. When we think about people who write on other people's lives, they're called biographers, aren't they? And if we think about all the biographies written about famous people, let's pick Napoleon, for example. I went and had a bit of a look on Amazon to see how many biographies I could see of Napoleon. Now, I kind of stopped counting because I was getting a bit tired and I couldn't be bothered to continue counting. But I saw at least over a couple of dozen different books that are biographies about the life of Napoleon. Here we have different people writing about the same person. Do we expect that all of these books talking about Napoleon will say exactly the same thing and will give exactly the same information? In fact, these different accounts of Napoleon's life quite often sort of look at his life through different lenses, look at his life through different pieces of information. So some of them talk about his life from the perspective of the memoirs of his private secretary. Others analyse him as a military general and his tactics, and yet others focus on the rise and fall from power. Do we expect these writers to be in complete agreement all the time about everything about Napoleon's life? You wouldn't expect them to completely be in agreement all the time, would you? If you're reading some of these for a research project, for example. In fact, you might be asked to write about the differences of opinion about this person. But it doesn't make the person any less real at all because there's differences of opinion about him. In fact, because there's so many different biographies about him, so it sort of reflects that this has to be a person of history, a real person who lived and breathed and existed. So we don't expect the writers to be in complete agreement all the time, or to give exactly the same details. Lastly, we need to consider if these guys were making the information up about Jesus. Remember when they wrote their accounts of the gospel. They still wrote their accounts of the gospel in the living memory of those who had been around during the time. There were still people around who remembered the same events. And if they were spreading incorrect information about Jesus, they were likely to be refuted and also laughed at. I want you to take this quote by F.F. Bruce. He says the disciples could not afford to risk inaccuracies, to not speak of willful manipulation of the facts, which would be exposed by those who would only be too glad to do so. On the contrary, one of the strong points in the original apostolic preaching is the confident appeal to the knowledge of the hearers. Quite often you hear in the New Testament them saying, you know about these facts, you saw these events, referring back to the same things. If they were making those events up and they were appealing to the memory of the hearers, it wouldn't have made much sense. But they continually do this right throughout the New Testament. We see this, for example, in the statement of the Apostle Peter in his letter, which he wrote only about 30 years after Jesus' death. He said, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Now let me put this in context. This was written 30 years after Jesus. You might say, well, that's a fair amount of time. Well, can anyone tell me what happened in Victoria about 30 years ago last month? It was last month we had the 30-year anniversary. Can anyone remember? Ash Wednesday fires. If I was to come along and tell you that they didn't happen, and they were just made up by a bunch of people to scam insurance companies, who here would have a problem with me saying that? There would be a lot of people here in living memory that would have a problem with that, wouldn't they? In fact, if I was to make that sort of claim publicly, you'd expect that there would be a bit of a reaction, wouldn't you? You'd expect it maybe to be splashed over the news and people starting to get a little bit upset about that. Well, that's about the same time period in which Peter makes that statement. So So we need to go, this leads us to the next and last test, which is the external evidence test, looking at the New Testament. So this test essentially asks us, are there other documents that confirm or deny any of the internal evidence that we get in the New Testament? Did others write about the same events that the New Testament writers wrote about? And did they write about Jesus himself? Did they talk about anything that happens in the New Testament? Can we test what they said against what the New Testament says to see if there's a difference? Well, firstly, though, we need to actually consider one question. Why would anyone within a lifetime of Jesus have wanted to write about him who wasn't a follower of him? When you really think about it, was he a significant person on the stage of the world in the time he lived? Was he really that significant to the whole world during his lifetime? Well, you'd have to question that. Because think about this. Would the Roman historians have been interested in mentioning Jesus? And should we expect that they would have? Remember that Jesus was a Jew, first of all. And the Jews were widespread in the empire, but they weren't of much interest to the Romans. Other than when they started to rebel and be a bit of a problem, and then they didn't like him. Which occasionally happened. But on the world scale at the time, Jerusalem was not an important city. In fact, it was a bit of an outpost. It was kind of like, if you think about Johnsonville here, how important is that on the national scale? When it comes to elections, how many politicians do you see coming down to Johnsonville to find out what's really important to the people down there? That's kind of like what Jerusalem would have been like in the days of Rome. Did the Romans even have any interest in the affairs of the Jews? As long as it didn't interrupt their civil rule, they didn't care what the Jews believed. How much attention do you think a Jewish itinerant preacher who preached for only 3.5 years and then was killed as a criminal, who never travelled more than 200 kilometres from home, how much interest do you think those in the empire would have on this figure? Really, we wouldn't expect them to even make any mention of him at all. But what we do see is amazing when it's viewed in this light. One of the earliest mentions of Jesus from a Roman source is Tacitus, who is considered one of the most reliable and unbiased historians of the ancient world. In giving an account of the fire of Rome, which is now most likely accredited to Nero, this is what he declared when he said that Nero decided to blame. He said, Nero decided to blame and inflict the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Is there anything in there that contradicts what the New Testament says about Jesus? In fact, there's only things that back up what the New Testament says about Jesus. And what's this mischievous superstition? It's interesting that after Jesus died, the disciples claimed he came back to life again 3 days later. But the priests in Jerusalem started saying, well, no, he didn't come back to life again. The disciples came and stole his body. What do you think this mischievous superstition most probably was? It was most probably the resurrection of Christ, when we look at all the evidence that there is. So this is what Tacitus has to say in AD 116. Interesting. When we have a look at some of the other writers in the Roman Empire around this time, we see some other historians who mention Jesus. We see Josephus mentions Jesus 3 separate occasions. And the earliest reference we have of him, the latest reference we actually have is AD 93. The earliest reference we have from Josephus is AD 75 of Jesus. He doesn't go into a great amount of detail, but just like Tacitus, nothing he says contradicts what the Bible has to say. What about the others? We've got Suetonius, who wrote from about AD 117 to 138. Again, he mentions Jesus. We also have Thallus. Now, Thallus is interesting because we don't have any of his writings, but a lot of ancient historians constantly quote him. So we don't have any of his writings left today, but we've got a lot of quotes of what he said by other historians. And it is said that Thallus said in AD 52 that in Jerusalem around the time of Jesus' death, that there was darkness and there was an earthquake. Interesting. Which is what the New Testament has to say about this. Well, what about some of the others? We also have Pliny the Younger. And he wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan in AD 112. And he was describing the Christians to Emperor Trajan. And he was describing their worship practices, and he says to Emperor Trajan in his letter, they sang alternate verses, a hymn to Christ as to a god. He was saying that right back then they were singing hymns to Jesus, right back then. Now this is not to mention some of the Christian historians who lived around this time. Some of the Christian historians who lived and wrote a lot about Jesus are Clement of Rome, who wrote about 95 AD, Ignatius, who wrote from between 70 to 110 AD, Polycarp, who wrote from about 70 to 156. The interesting thing about Polycarp was he claims that he was a direct disciple of the Apostle John. So he's only one separation away from Jesus himself. Then we've got Tatian, who wrote about AD 170, and Irenaeus, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Now, a lot of people say we can't trust any of what these guys write because they're Christians. But do we ever say we can't trust what Romans wrote about Rome because they're Romans? If there's so much evidence and so much of these guys writing, and their works were being spread all over the empire, can we completely discount what they have to say? It would be very, very difficult. So when we have a look at some of these pieces of evidence that we see throughout the time of Jesus and just afterwards, the amazing thing about all of these writings is that there's no information in any of these writings which contradicts the detail given in the Bible or even directly challenges it. In fact, they only confirm some of the details recorded in the New Testament to be verifiable and reliable. And this is not to mention in detail the amazing accuracy with which they describe some of the historical events of their day. In fact, Luke, almost every piece of detail that he talks about in terms of what's happening in the wider world, all the things Luke has said about what was happening in the wider Roman world at the time have been proven to be accurate. So we don't even see any inaccuracies there. Based on all of these above tests, what can we say about this person, Jesus? What can we realistically say about his life compared to what we can say about anyone else? Based on all of these tests, the New Testament passes with flying colours like no other book of antiquity. There is no other book of antiquity that passes these tests as comprehensively as the New Testament does. Josh McDowell has to say this as he summarises. He says, after trying to shatter the historicity and validity of Scripture, I came to the conclusion that it is historically trustworthy. If one discards the Bible as being unreliable, then one must discard almost all of literature in antiquity. What then can we know, based on all of this information, about this person Jesus from this evidence? Well, Dr. Geisler, who did some study on this, has this to say. He summarises it this way. He says that the New Testament, based on what the other evidence shares about the facts of his life, informs us that firstly, Jesus existed and he was from Nazareth. Secondly, he lived a wise and virtuous life. Thirdly, we know that he was crucified in Palestine under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar at Passover time, and that he was considered a Jewish king. Fourth, we know that he was believed by his disciples to have been raised from the dead 3 days later. Fifth, his enemies acknowledged that he performed feats of what they called sorcery. Sixth, his small band of disciples multiplied rapidly, spreading even as far as Rome. And lastly, his disciples denied polytheism. They lived moral lives and they worshipped Christ as God. This picture confirms the view of Christ in the New Testament as a real historical person, and that many of the details written about him and in this document of the New Testament were accurate as far as we can tell, and as far as they can be assessed. Tomorrow night, I want to invite you to come back, looking at the idea that Jesus was a real historical figure, and that some of the details, as far as we can tell in the New Testament which we've looked at, show that these details were correct about his life. The question we need to ask ourselves next is, well, why does he really matter? Is he if he was actually a person and he did some of these things, then isn't he just only of interest to religious type of people? What impact has he really had on anyone's life in reality? Has he had any impact? We're going to look at a number of different parts of our society today and see whether Jesus has had any real influence at all, whether we can trace any real evidence of any influence he's had on our society today, and see whether we owe anything to this man of 2,000 years ago or not. So I'd like to invite you back tomorrow night for that.